Hello and welcome to The Horrible Idea, a podcast about horror movies. I'm Stephanie, and I'm young, strong, and animal-like.
I'm Jack, and in this episode, we're going to make them make it with each other.
So, each week we pick a scary movie and talk about it. I'm a scaredy cat. Jack is less so. If you have a scary movie that you think would really scare us, hit us up on Instagram at The Horrible Idea, or on Twitter at HorriblePod.
Yeah. This episode, we're going to be talking about a big old yikes, and that is Last House on the Left. Stephanie, tell us some facts about this movie.
So this is the original Last House on the Left, which was released August 30th, 1972, written and directed by Wes Craven, with a budget of $87,000. Pretty conservative budget there. And box office $3.1 million.
Nice. IMDb gives it a 6 out of 10. Rotten Tomatoes gives it a 62. And the Rotten Tomato audience score is 50, right down the middle. And this is Wes Craven's directorial debut. And it was produced by Sean S. Cunningham, who would go on to direct and produce Friday the 13th, another of our pod alum.
Yeah. So this movie, I know, had a lot of controversy, right?
Oh, yeah.
When it came out. And I read that it was actually banned in the UK for a considerable amount of time. I think until sometime in the aughts.
It was banned in a lot of countries. It was banned in Italy. They had to cut it.
Wait, it was banned in Italy, the country that produced Salo?
Yes.
This is nowhere near. Anyway, whatever.
But they had to cut it and recut it to try to get it to have an R rating as opposed to an X rating.
Yes, but then I saw, and this was IMDb trivia, so who knows the veracity of this, but I saw that they cut it and cut it and cut it and couldn't get an X rating, and then I think it was Wes Craven. I forget if it was Wes Craven or Sean S. Cunningham had a buddy on the ratings board.
Yeah.
And so then they put all that stuff back in and got an R rating just because they had a buddy and then released it with an R rating. I don't know.
Yeah.
I thought that was funny.
It is. And there are apparently a bunch of different cuts of it that have been put out over the years. And it fluctuates from anywhere between an hour to 80 minutes. So.
Yeah, the cut I watched on Amazon Prime was an hour and 22 minutes, I think.
Same, yeah, 82 minutes, I think. Some alternative titles for this movie were Sex Crime of the Century, which I think they mention that line in it. Also, Night of Vengeance, and Krug and Company. Krug. Is it Krug or Krug?
Is that... I wonder if that's your New York thing. Is Krug...
He's a New Yorker. He's from New York.
Is Krug the Mario of horror?
David Hess.
So I just think it's Krug because then he goes on to name his other villain Kruger, which... Right.
Yeah, I think it is Krug.
Everybody kept kind of relating to each other. Anyway. Yeah, Krug is he's a piece of work.
Krug life.
So I will say there were a lot of varied reviews, but I found it interesting. Ebert actually gave it 3.5 stars, and Pauline Kael gave it a really good review as well. Now, Gene Siskel hated it and thought that Wes Craven was a terrible person and just totally kind of was full of vitriol about this, which kind of cements my feeling that I always kind of sided more with Ebert.
Well,
between the two of them,
Ebert wrote Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, so that really puts into your mind what is going on in his head. He was kind of a weird guy, which is a positive in my book.
Yeah. So I wanted to read a little excerpt from Ebert's review, and this is, some of it is, I'm just picking lines out of it, but he said, Last House on the Left is a tough, bitter little sleeper of a movie that's about 4 times as good as you'd expect. It has a powerful narrative told so directly and strongly that the audience, mostly in the mood for just another good old exploitation film, was rocked back on its psychic heels. There's a good ear for dialogue and nuance, and there is evil in this movie. Not bloody escapism or a thrill a minute, but a fully developed sense of the vicious natures of the killers. There is no glory in this violence.
Yeah, it's interesting. Out of all the movies we've watched, these feel like the most like human sort of murderers. Like, they're horrible people, but they're also sort of like believable people.
Yeah, they're not like they don't have any kind of seemingly supernatural thing where they can kind of appear suddenly, or they're very grounded kind of in reality, which I think is probably what freaked people out so much.
Sure, yeah. Another interesting fact I read is that Wes Craven walked out of the premiere of Reservoir Dogs.
Yes, I read that too.
And then Quentin Tarantino was like, "What the fuck, dude?" And he was like, he was like, the guy who directed Last House on the Left walked out of my movie for being too graphic. And he's like, "Yeah, well, your movie is, glorifying."
He thought it glorified it, right? Yeah. And I think his point was that, like, Last House on the Left makes these people look like bad people. Though, David Hess's hotness makes it slightly complicated.
It is a complicated thing, especially when his shirt is off. So apparently, do you know his sort of background?
David Hess, so I read a little bit, so I know he was mostly like a music guy.
Right. He like co-wrote a song with Elvis and did the original version of All Shook Up. Well, the original white version of All Shook Up. And I listened to it, and it's not horrible. But yeah, he was like a musician. This whole movie, so I may have mentioned on the podcast that I grew up in New York a couple of times.
Really?
Yeah.
We need to like throw in like Frank Sinatra whenever you mention that.
Frank Sinatra,
like a little sting.
Yeah. I
don't know.
So I was a punk in the 90s going to CBGBs. And so I talked to a lot of old punks who were around in the 70s. And all of them were David Hess. Like, he was so much like that sort of personification.
David Hess, but not Krug.
Right. Well, it was somewhere in between David Hess and Krug.
Hopefully with less, blood all over their clothing.
I didn't ask a lot of questions. All right, so preconceptions. You'd heard of this a little bit?
I had heard of it, like, very lightly. Like, I knew the title, and I knew that, like, people were like, oh, that one's extreme, but I didn't know anything about the plot. I didn't know anything about who was in it. I didn't know it was directed by Wes Craven. And actually, like, I guess if I just thought of the title, like, somehow I pictured this happening, like, I pictured most of it happening, like, in a rural area, which I know eventually they get there. But when they first, like, go to the city, I was like, oh, what? And, like, I don't know, I guess I pictured it being kind of like a trapped in the house movie.
Right, because...
like, in its entirety.
Right, because the title has nothing to do with the movie in any possible way.
Yeah, I'm like, is Mary's house the last house on the left, I guess? But that's not really referenced. Whatever.
Yeah.
What about you?
I'm actually surprised I'd never seen this, because it seems in teenage Jack's wheelhouse very much, but I'd never seen it, and I did know that it was like Wes Craven's first movie, but for some reason I thought it was like a something else. I thought it was like a college, like a sorority house thing or something else. I don't know.
Yeah, I thought it was like a haunted house or something. I had no idea it was like this realist, psychopath.
Yeah. Well, since we're
thing.
going down that road, let's break down this plot.
So, two teenage girls, Mary and Phyllis. Phyllis is the bad girl. Mary's the good girl. They're heading to a rock concert in Manhattan for Mary's 17th birthday. They try to store some top-notch grass and are kidnapped by a gang of psychotic escaped convicts.
Yes, the gang is led by the sadistic Krug Stillo. And the gang includes his heroin-addicted illegitimate son, Junior, their friend Weasel, who is a pederast, peeping Tom, and murderer, and their super
quality guy,
super hot, generally crazy hair hopper mall, Sadie. So yeah,
that's a good sum up. I mean, I think some hijinks ensue after that, but we'll get into that.
Yeah, I mean,
it was a wild ride. I mean, so just from the beginning,
it starts with tits. It starts with tits.
Yeah. And Mary's very into her own look. She gets out of the shower and she's just kind of staring at herself and she's like, and then she like goes downstairs like she's going to go out to meet her bad girlfriend. And her parents are just talking about her tits like nonstop.
Yeah,
and they're like
I could see her nipples. Look at her. There is a lot of nipple talk.
And she's like touching them in front of her parents, and then she's talking about her mom's tits and the torpedo bras, and it was a lot of familial tit talk. And I was like, okay. But the best part of that whole opening, and they did it a couple times, was they would cut to a close-up of the dog, the dog reaction shot. And the dog is just kind of like, which I thought was really funny. So, yeah, I had a feeling while I was watching it that you were going to find that initial, it was very up your alley, the whole, like...
Somewhat. It was weird. Did you get... So, Mary's mom, Estelle, was pretty much the exact character that Amy Sedaris goes into when she is like
Strangers with Candy?
No. Like when she writes her books and just sort of like her actual she gets into this weird like 60s, 70s mom sort of like ugly casserole. Anyhow.
Yeah, well she was very, I liked the mom a lot. She was kind of, straight edge at the beginning, but then she really, she brings it home and bites it. Anyway, we'll get to that, but
spoilers.
So basically when they're going, it's like Mary's 17th birthday, which when I first saw it, I thought her name was Mari for sure, because it's Mari.
Right, because it was written on the
mailbox, right?
Mailbox, yeah.
So, which I was like, was that just for her birthday, or do they always just have their daughter's name on the mailbox?
Also, did you notice there was a weird throwaway line? So it opens with this like old guy who's not her dad, a different guy, like going up to the mailbox and like getting the mail.
Talking about how hot she is.
He's like, yeah, that Mary lives there. She sure is a piece of ass.
Yeah, and then that's when they cut to her admiring herself in the mirror, where she's like, yeah, I am. And like, but yeah, so they're like, okay, now we're gonna head to the city. First, they like have a little picturesque, like
drinking
hang
montage.
out by like a creek, and that's when Mary is talking about how hot she is now. She's like, oh yeah, like I grew like breasts, and now I'm super hot. And
it's like, they're okay, Mary.
Yeah, she's very into her own look, but.
And Phyllis is like, yeah, I guess.
Yeah. She's just like, whatever, let's get out of here and get some weed. So then they drive to the city, and this is one of my, I do really like this convention in movies where they do the exposition via radio or TV reports, like rather than having, you know, in a movie that's an hour, less than an hour and a half, it's, you know, economical, but they have the whole radio report about the escaped convicts. So, but it seemed like they said there were two. So was it Weasel and Krug, or Krug and his son?
Yeah, it's Weasel and Krug,
right,
and then they kind of come find the.
Because Sadie
the son.
helped them escape or something, right? Because there's something in there about how she like kicked a bunch of people or something. I don't know. There was some little bit. That's where the young, strong, and animal-like thing came from, because that's how they describe her in the radio.
Now I did notice that. So when they do get picked up by the gang and kidnapped, I looked at the clock and there was 1 hour left of like a 1 hour 20-minute movie. So I'm like, oh boy, this is going to be a lot of kidnapping. This is not going to go well.
Yeah, it was kind of very well split into thirds. It was like pre-kidnap, all the terrible crap that happens after they're kidnapped, and then them at the parents' house is like the final act.
The coincidence of going right back to their house.
Yeah. So I did notice at the point where we're hanging out with the gang before the two girls come in, that Sadie's singing in the rain, and I was like, was
a bathtub.
Yeah, was this before Clockwork Orange? I'm looking it up now because I needed to. No, it's a year after Clockwork Orange, but
all right.
So maybe they had already seen it, but anyway, in the 70s, everyone was really just being subversive with Singing in the Rain.
That whole bath scene, I know you're going to be shocked by this entire conversation about that, but that whole bath scene really captured my imagination, because she's sort of sitting there like filleting her lipstick, and then she keeps like putting it on again and again, and she's talking to Junior, who it seems she has a primary sort of relationship with Krug, but then sort of flirts with everyone.
Well, at one point Weasel says, I thought she was everyone's girl.
Right. Which is an interesting dynamic. And then also sort of charmed by Junior. He's a weird guy.
He kind of reminded me too much of Shia LaBeouf, who is, just very recently found out, is a piece of shit.
We do not stand Shia LaBeouf.
No,
see, he reminded me a lot of one of the Ramones, sort of an amalgamation of all of the Ramones, really.
Sure.
Junior. Whereas Krug reminded me a lot of David Berkowitz.
Oh, really? Oh, he's so
much
hotter than David Berkowitz.
He is hotter, but he has that like beefy scariness.
He reminded me of John Bernthal.
Oh yeah, okay.
Who, I think if John Bernthal grew his hair out and had like kind of a curly 70s mop, he would look like this. John Bernthal, one of the hottest people ever. But so I will say for Junior, he has an amazing ribbit. Like he was doing the frog thing, I was like, all right, Junior. He had like a really deep like bass ribbit. I was impressed.
He must have been hired like for that ribbit. I think that was his
the sides for his audition just said like ribbit. Oh, maybe he was doing the ADR for Hell Comes to Frogtown.
So here's an interesting thing about Krug. So Martin Kove, who was the main bad guy in Karate Kid, you know, the dojo master of Cobra Kai. So he plays one of the sheriffs in this. I don't know if you caught him.
Oh, those stupid sheriffs.
But anyway, he was originally supposed to play Krug, Martin Kove.
That would not have... I would have not liked that as much, I don't think.
He did not have the raw animal magnetism.
Yeah. Yeah, Krug. So when first of all, he's like very young to be a dad of Junior. He looked like he was like 8 years older than Junior.
Which, I mean, yeah. I mean, I'm guessing
I'm guessing he
he
was a
was
teenager, but
right.
yeah, still.
He looks 10, 15 years old, I think. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I was just like,
I support a young single father. You know, I think that's a good.
I do, except for when they intentionally get their son hooked on heroin so that they can control him, which is what was said in the radio dispatch.
And then sort of like force them to commit suicide.
I will say that scene was upsetting, obviously, but that was when I was like, all right, David Hess, this is a good performance. Like he like kicked it up a notch in that. I was like, that should have been your FYC reel, except for that I don't think anyone would have considered this film. But
well, I use that as a monologue sometimes when I'm trying out for things. That and the piss your pants scene.
Oh boy. Well, and so the other guy is Weasel. So Weasel is played by an actor named Fred J. Lincoln, who was predominantly a porn actor. I think before and perhaps after this. And he was also a part owner of Plato's Retreat, which was a New York City sex club. And he apparently later said that it was one of his biggest regrets was being in this movie.
Which is weird. Well, apparently there's also been rumors that this movie was originally supposed to be like a sort of porn.
Yes. And then they like toned it down during production, apparently. But so he, when I saw him, at first I thought it was, he looked a lot like, I'm forgetting the actor's name now, but he plays Chris Moltisanti on The Sopranos. I was like, he looks like him with gray hair, which I think now that actor has gray hair. But
his hair was really in like a poof. It was
yes, like a bouffant.
Well, while we're talking about all these characters, what were your favorite characters?
So I would say I really liked the parents. So at first they were a little weird, and I was like, okay, please stop talking about your daughter's tits. But then in the end, they're really committed to like, we're fucking taking revenge against these assholes who killed our daughter. Like, you know, and clearly the scenes with the cops were my least favorite part of this whole thing. I was like, we didn't need any of this. I don't know why it's even in here. But the parents were cool. You know, the mom does this whole like fake out with Weasel where she's like, ooh, I really want you. And he's like, ooh, I could make it with you with my hands tied behind my back. And there's this whole weird kind of sex scene. But then she like bites his dick. And I thought she bit it off, but I think she just bit it until
it was
he was
weird,
like
because
incapacitated.
then she sort of like apologized.
Did she? Oh, I don't know. Yeah, but so she like lured him out of the house and like over to the lake or something. Right. And then so they were probably my favorite. And then I had a very complicated relationship with Krug because he was like super hot, but then he was like a totally evil, bad, horrific person, like character. Right. So I'll say I don't love the character of Krug, but David Hess can get it.
Sure. Well, it's no surprise that Sadie captured my eye. She was fascinating. You know, we went over the bathtub scene, the whole dynamic with her and the whole gang doing a dad and a son. It was complicated.
I did like that she was like, she called him a chauvinist dog.
Right.
Yeah. She kind of stood up for herself at certain points.
She did. She also like stood up for like, hey, I want to get these girls first. She was very like predatory queer superpower. And her eye makeup was perfect even when she was covered with blood. And she was, you know, down to fuck, down to fight, down to rob a bank, down to do whatever. And similarly to you, my feelings about Krug Stillo are, I wrote here in my notes, complicated and upsetting.
Yes. Yes, I would agree with that.
And so were there any why'd you do that moments?
Is anybody home? Why did you do that? I'll be right back.
I had a couple. So, at first, which I kind of lightly discussed earlier, like, has any song had such a, like, topsy-turvy timeline throughout its lifespan as Singin' in the Rain? Because Singin' in the Rain in the movie is such a, like, joyous, like, feel-good song. Like, and it's kind of the magic of movies, and he's dancing around, and there's the, it's a very, like, buoyant, kind of happy song. And then the way it's used, and I know that this has become sort of a convention to, like, slow down songs and, like, make them kind of creepy. But the way it's used in this and in Clockwork Orange, it's so upsetting, and it's sung by these, like, psychopaths. I just find that an interesting thing that's kind of happened. I mean, I don't know of any other song that I can think of that's had that kind of dramatic shifts.
Yeah.
In tone.
Yeah, the music in the whole movie is very interesting. We'll get to it a little bit more, but my first why is, okay, so Phyllis is supposed to be from Manhattan. She says she lives in Manhattan. And, Manhattan in the 70s, Lower East Side in the 70s, there's plenty of places you go to buy weed. Like, I was not born in 1970, but even I know you go down to Washington Square Park, or you go to St. Mark's, or there's a whole bunch of places you could buy any drug you could possibly want. You don't just walk up to some dude on a stoop and then go into his house. Yeah, generally all of my questions about this movie involve drug buying etiquette.
Well, I think that she was sort of like one of those girls that's like, yeah, I'm from New York, but she, like, moved when she was 7 or something.
A poser, yeah.
So my next question was
Connecticut Yankee fan, yeah.
I don't get that, but
people from Connecticut who are Yankees fans. Never mind.
Oh, all right. So my second question was, again, about the music in the movie. So when they're driving from New York City to the country, and they've got the girls in the trunk and everything, there's this song playing that's like, Krug and Junior, Sadie and Weasel. It's like, that's not the lyrics, but it's something similar to that. And it's like, what a gang, they got the Cunningham girls in the trunk. And it's just like a song about their exploits. And I was like, is this a song that was written in the world of the film? I know that David Hess, like, did a lot of the music for the movie, but I don't know, that song, and, like, kind of the tone of the music throughout, like, David Hess, love your performance. The music was a little bit out of sync with the tone of some of the scenes. Like, sometimes the music would cut in and it would be like 10 degrees shy of yakety sax. It was like very kind of, I don't know, didn't jive with what was going on screen sometimes.
Yeah, and I think sometimes Wes Craven was... So I think a lot of these, like, super early films by these sort of well-known directors have a much more avant-garde... Like, they're trying some stuff. They're trying some, like, film school shit. And in this, I think he was definitely trying to, like, have crazy music while things were normal, and then have, like, placid music when people were getting raped and killed and shit. So I think sometimes that was successful, and sometimes it was just confusing. But I do know David Hess wrote all of that music and performed all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, apparently Stephen Chapin, who is like he's scored other stuff, but he did like some of the score and the just like random orchestration, but all the songs were 100% Hess truck ready.
Yeah. I'll say I feel like David Hess was far more successful in his performance than he was with his music, in my opinion.
To a degree, but I thought I didn't hate it. And it kind of made me think, like, why didn't we see more of this guy? He's like such a presence.
Yeah, his performance was, I thought it was really great, and maybe because of the reaction to the movie, he didn't get much. I know he went on to work with some really, like, well-regarded European directors, like, doing the script, like, revisions for the English language versions. Like, he worked with Fassbinder and I forget who else, but some really well-regarded, like, directors. So it seems like he just kind of moved to, like, behind the camera and, like, did, post-production or music work. But yeah.
Yeah, he almost seemed like David Hess seemed like a character who would pop up in like a John Cassavetes film or something, like this powerful, neo-realist New York gritty guy. Anyhow, I just put that in there to sound smart. I had to look up.
Yeah, you didn't at all look that up.
No. All right, Jack's pitch of the week.
Let's hear it.
All right. It works better if it's pronounced Krug, but Krug Life. Krug Life is a family sitcom in the style of like a Full House or like a Family Matters. And Krug Stillo, single father, just trying to make his way, chomping a cigar, reading the newspaper, while Sadie's downstairs tying up some co-eds, threatening them with a straight razor. And, Junior's up in his room with posters on the wall, shooting up dope.
Whatever, and, Dad.
And their wacky neighbor Weasel drops by. And, the whole thing. Do you remember Natural Born Killers? There was that scene where it's sort of like a play-up of like a sitcom where they were showing like
style,
yeah, like that. The nuclear family being shown as a sick farce constructed by corporations to sell us sugary cereal and deodorant, and shit like that.
Would it have a laugh track?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, good.
And sometimes it would just happen like when Sadie is like killing someone.
Perfect. Well, that would match the tone fluctuation of this movie for sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, so Krug and the gang, how do they compare to other slashers? I mean, is this a slasher film? What is this movie?
I mean, there's some slashing, so I'd say
is it
yes.
A tone poem? Is it a tone poem?
Oh, like She Dies Tomorrow? No, I'd say it was. I mean, it's this. So we were discussing this at the beginning, but this is, I believe, the earliest movie that we've covered. It was released in 1972, and I think the next closest was Texas Chainsaw in 74. So, I mean, it seemed to me sort of just like it almost just seemed like a really well-made, fucked up college film school movie.
Like, yeah, it did have a very film school movie vibe to it.
Yeah, because it was... Go ahead.
It was trying to be... it was both like trying to be like, fuck you, world, but then at the same time, it was also like trying to be artistic.
Yes. And I mean, I think we haven't really discussed it too much, but there are some really graphics, well, they don't show a lot, but there are very intense scenes of like sadism and sexual assault and such. So it seems almost sort of like, I would actually say it's a little bit closer in the way I felt about it to something like Texas Chainsaw, where it's kind of about the psychology of, there's some psychology of the characters involved, but also just like really hardcore like psychopathy of these characters. So compared to other slashers, it was also like there was a team, right? I feel like a
Right,
lot of
yeah.
these other slashers have kind of a singular person. Even Texas Chainsaw is almost, that's why I think it's a little bit similar to that, because there's, again, sort of like a team of people, even though Leatherface is the main guy.
I mean, if you
But-
break it down, it almost has the same plot as Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah, basically. I mean, there's no, there's a little bit of stuff in the city, but
Also,
yeah,
someone gets killed with a chainsaw.
that's true. Yeah, I loved that chainsaw whole sequence. But yeah, so I think it's kind of, it also in some ways sort of made me think of it as like the granddaddy of torture porn movies to a certain extent, because obviously most of the modern day torture porn movies are way more intense than this as far as like the things that are done and what's shown on camera, but sort of just this, they don't just kill these girls outright. Like they
Right.
drag it out and they bring them to the woods and they make them do all these horrible things and then they run away and then they, it's kind of dragged out.
Also, like the morality is not as sort of black. It doesn't feel like they're being punished for being whatever they were, particularly.
Yeah, they would
where
like.
I
They
think
didn't have sex. I mean, they just kind of went to the city to go to a concert.
they didn't even get any weed.
I know. They just like asked about it, and then it was like, "You done goofed." like, but
Yeah, I did like when Weasel like shut the door and flipped the lock, and then Phyllis was just like, "Oh shit."
yes, I wrote that in my notes. That was actually kind of comical because at that moment he locks the door. Sadie like leaps out of her blanket and is like, "Rah!" And then Phyllis is like, "Oh." It's like kind of quick 3 shots, and it was. That's the thing is like sometimes these 70s movies, just because of the way that they're edited and everything, there's, I don't know if at the time, I wonder if at the time that kind of stuff had the same tone to people as it does now to us.
Yeah, because there's also a lot of points where the acting is really good, like especially all of Krug's stuff is just like a lot of it's really good. But in that initial part, so they lock that and there's a whole bunch of like horrifying banter, and then I mean it seems like Phyllis gets like raped.
Yeah.
And Mary is like watching, but her reaction is so ridiculous. She's just sort of like, "Oh dear. Oh my."
Yeah.
It's just like really out of proportion to what's going
It's
on.
kind of a tepid response. Yeah, and like there was also, I kind of found it it wasn't funny, but it was kind of like a weird shift where they were showing that, like the initial sort of assault, and then they cut to the parents decorating the house for Mary's birthday. But
Right.
but it's like it's in sort of like they almost feel sort of slapstick because they're kind of like what
Right.
to do, and then they're like, let's make love in the living room, and then it cuts back to this. It's, I don't know. It was just it was some weird choices.
But yes, but also it felt like there were choices, which is kind of refreshing sometimes, because it definitely felt like something. It definitely didn't feel like this movie got any notes from the producers or anything.
No.
You know,
Yeah.
this very much felt like a movie that until 10 minutes before they started shooting was going to be a porn, and then they decided to make it
Yeah.
just not quite a porn.
Well, they hired a porn star for it, so
Sure.
Yeah.
So, all right, final reactions.
All right, so I liked this movie. I you know, I'd say, you know, the scenes of kind of like upsetting sexual assault were honestly no, they weren't to me like any worse than, or actually in some ways they were better than some of the things that you see now in movies that have similar topics and plot points. Um, and and again, it was not at all, it didn't feel at all glorified or or you know, I'm watching it from the perspective of now, but um it didn't seem what's the word I'm looking for? It didn't seem as over the top as some of the like torture porn movies that come out now with things like, you know, I haven't seen Hostel, but I know kind of generally some of the plot, or things like Human Centipede, or things like that. Um, and I thought there were some really good performances. You know, David Hess in particular, when he really convincingly plays this terrible, awful human being. And in that little scene where Junior points the gun at him, and he's kind of talking him through how to work the gun, and then telling him to kill himself. It was very upsetting, but his performance was so it was very riveting.
Yeah.
And the whole time I was watching it, I was very engaged with the plot. There were a few moments that were a little goofy. I would say the weakest point in this is the whole plot line with the cops, because they just sort of, it seems like it's a trope in these movies where the cops are just useless. And I guess maybe that's the director's way of getting around the question of why didn't they just call the cops? Because the cops are always portrayed as being total dum-dums. But they have to hitch a ride on the roof of this woman's truck, and she's got all these chickens and...
Oh yeah, that was...
Yeah.
The minute that scene started, I was like, oh, you know what this movie didn't have? Racism.
Yeah, so
just got a little
I will say
taste
that
of it.
that woman was played by the maid and nanny of, I believe it was Sean Cunningham's family. It was somebody involved in the production, because they shot, Mary's house was someone involved in the production's house.
It was Sean.
Parents'
It was
house.
Sean. It was Sean's parents' house.
Yeah, and then that was his parents' maid and nanny that played Ada. Anyway, I was just like, what? Those scenes were the weakest part of the movie to me, and really didn't just jive with the tone. The tonal switches between the killers and Mary's parents were kind of discordant, but they made sense because it's oh, they're at home preparing while their daughter is being tortured and killed, blah, blah. But the stuff with the cops was just stupid. But overall, I really liked it. You know, I thought it was for the time, especially, kind of, I don't want to use the word daring, but, you know, I think it was pretty innovative, perhaps, in some of the things that they did, and the use of not well-known actors. So I'd say scare factor. I would give it, I don't know, maybe a 4. I wasn't really scared, because the thing that tends to scare me is jumps and things like that, and these kind of old school makeup and effects don't really scare me too much. But I mean, you know, the idea of going, you know, being kidnapped and taken into the woods is also something that I think a lot of women think about on a semi-daily or weekly basis. So it's not a novel fear to me. But entertainment factor, I think I'd probably give this an 8. I was really engaged. It was a nice short movie. And I think they kept up the pace well. And they were weird, evil, interesting characters to watch.
Yeah.
What about you?
I agree with most of that. I mean, like I said before, I am sort of very in love with New York in the 70s, the like grittiness of it. And Krug seemed like a guy who I would meet backstage at a Richard Hell show at CBGB's. Like, he definitely seemed like somebody who I could have met in my life and like very luckily did not get engaged with in any way.
I'm glad neither of us have met Krug.
Yeah. I mean, I hung out with Weasel once, but he was kind of a dick. And yeah, have you seen the George Lucas, like his first film, his student film, THX 1138?
Not that I can recall.
Well, there's sort of like, it definitely felt like a student film in some ways to me. And it reminded me of when I took my first photography class, and the professor was great, and he had this old Leica that he just cradled in his hand. And I ended up like assisting him a couple of times. And he was like an old school photographer who was just teaching to make money. And he's like, yeah, these kids, they end up just taking pictures of their girlfriends naked. And that's fun to see sometimes, I guess. But, there's not a lot of creativity there. And there was a little bit of that, like, to just sort of get a reaction. Start with tits, make the blood look like blood. That was another thing I was reading where they mixed more blue into the blood so it really looked more
and it was
like human blood.
Caramel or something or honey, I forget. It was some sort of natural substance that they used.
It was corn syrup.
Okay.
Yeah,
was it corn syrup?
Corn syrup is what a lot of people use for blood.
No, I know. I thought it was something else, but whatever.
Possibly. Anyhow, so yeah, I liked it. And I get a scare factor of like 5. Like, I found myself disturbed. Like that, the last couple of scenes of like, killing someone, carving your name into someone's chest, and the sort of the last rape was, I like actually couldn't watch it for a second. I just like to hit that little plus 10 second thing a couple of times. Yeah. So yeah, it got a reaction out of me, which a lot of movies don't. So I'll give it a 6 out of 10 scare factor. And entertainment factor, yeah, I give it an 8 as well.
This is a landmark. The first time you've been more scared of a movie than I am.
Yeah, I'd say disturbed, but yeah, scared, disturbed.
Fear factor, scare factor, whatever it is.
Fear factor, disturbed. Any of those bands are all great. Monster Factory.
Let the bodies hit the floor.
So what do we have coming up next?
So next week we are doing a Jack pick, which is 2020's Freaky. A movie I don't know anything about, so I'm going to go into this totally blind. I'm not going to watch the trailer. I'm not going to look up any facts, so that'll be interesting. So in the meantime, give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever you listen, and reach out on social. Don't be scared.
Yeah. I only know Freaky from a couple of trailers, and I've got a little heat. That's all I've heard, that people are liking it. So if you have interesting facts about Freaky, or if you have a suggestion for a movie that might scare us, let us know on Twitter or email us at thehorribleidea@gmail.com. And do you guys know where we could score some righteous weed?
New York, New York,